Last Sunday, we kicked off a brand new series called Broken. And we acknowledge the fact that if you grieve, you have brokenness in your life. And if you don't have it, just hang on, it's coming. Aren't you glad you came to church today? But it's a reality in our lives. And this morning, we're taking a little different take on the same conversation. Last week we talked about broken lives. This week we're talking about what it means to have broken dreams. For instance, how many of you remember your teenage years? You some of it's a little hazy, isn't it? How many of you remember what you wanted to become during those teenage years? You see your hands. And how many of you became what you planned to become when you were 15 or 16 years old? 2 or 3 of you got a chance to do that. But when I look back across the spectrum of my life and other people's lives, I see all kinds of folks who struggle with the fact that they didn't get into the college they wanted, they never got to achieve the career they wanted. If you had a boyfriend or girlfriend in high school, they probably never became the spouse you thought they'd become. Many times when we're teenagers, we dream about traveling extensively. We dream about earning billions and billions of dollars. High school athletes every week dream about what it would mean to play in the NBA or the NFL, and yet across the course of history, less than 1% of all high school athletes actually make it to the NBA or the NFL. There's not a plan B and millions are lost. What are you going to do? When I was in my teenage years, I wanted to sing Christian music professionally. It's all I wanted to do. I talked about it all the time. I worked toward it a good bit of the time. And for about 5.5 years, starting at the age of 19, I got to do that for a while. But sometimes as you get older, life takes turns that you don't expect. Do you agree? Very rarely does life turn out the way that we've planned. And most of us are able to move beyond the broken dreams of our youth. But when our broken dreams follow us into adulthood, it's a different kind of a story. Whatever the dreams were as 15 and 16-year-olds when you're 25, 26, 35, 36 years old. And those dreams turn into a certain realm of reality because of infertility, or an injury that happened, or a career that didn't pan out, a divorce you didn't see coming, a disease that robbed you of your health, an accident that took away very precious things to you, the house that never got built. Broken dreams are a part of broken lives. Several years ago, I was doing a series of evangelistic and outreach services in Terre Haute, Indiana. And the services were going really well. It's a great church. And the pastor, the first day I was there, he introduced me to a couple who were heavily involved in the church and leaders in the church, and then didn't say much more. And then 2 days later, when we finished the service that evening, he said, "David, would you go to the hospital with me tomorrow morning?" And I said, "That's not common." And I said, "I'd be happy to. Is there something special going on?" He said, "You remember that couple I introduced you to the first day you were here?" I said, "Yeah, they were great." He said, "Well, what you don't know is 7 to 10 days ago, she had a miscarriage. It was their first child. They were a little bit older than the normal childbearing years. They were very excited. And about 4 or 5 months into the pregnancy, she miscarried, and she had been carrying that baby inside of her that she knew was dead for the last week and a half. And she said, "We're going into the hospital tomorrow to have a special procedure so they can remove the dead baby." And I remember walking into that hospital in Terre Haute, Indiana with this pastor. I remember looking at these people who were trying to keep their chin up, who were trying to keep their faith strong. And yet the grief and the pain and the loss of that shattered dream for the child that they had prayed for and wanted for so long, and now they're about to have a procedure that would remove the child that had already died within her womb. And I don't know how people do that stuff. I wish I had answers. We've got broken lives and broken dreams coming together in that one painful picture. Over the years in ministry, it's not particularly common, but increasingly more so than you might imagine, that I will sit and work with a couple who are planning to get married, and they're related, and they go through the premarital preparation and all of the stuff, and then 2 years later, one or both of them are sitting in front of me and they're talking about going through divorce. My own family, my parents were wonderful Christian people and served God faithfully, and we'd had the plans drawn up to move out in the countryside on a few acres of ground that my grandmother had allowed my dad to inherit early in life, and the dream home was going to be built, only to have the factory that my dad had worked for about 15 years shut down overnight, and there was no job to go ahead and complete the building, and we didn't get to do that. Early on in my 20s, I went and planted a church in Charlotte, North Carolina. We weren't setting the world on fire, but we were doing reasonably well, and I was having a blast. And I was thought that that would be the only church I was ever going to pastor my entire life. Charlotte was fast growing. I bought a house, and as there were a church plant meeting in an elementary school, that house served as our church office. That house is where our band rehearsed. That house is where our drama team rehearsed. That house is where our board came for meetings. And we grew to about 100 people or more in the first 6 months, 8 months. And I knew that Charlotte was a fast-growing, fast-paced city, but there was one thing I had overlooked. It never occurred to me in my 20s. It was also a highly transient city because people would get transferred there from Chicago or New York or Denver or Dallas or Kansas City. They might only be there 6 months to 2 years and get transferred out again. And I never took that into consideration. In that very first summer, after I bought my house, over 60 people had job transfers out of the community, and our church was down to like 30 people. We had to start all over again. Except there was not any money to pay a salary for a pastor. We still had a mortgage. For the next 3 to 4 months, I promise you, nearly every night, I ate grilled cheese and tater tots. Not only did I feel a part of me was broken, but there was a dream that we were pursuing, and we were on track to achieve that dream, and that dream was broken. We've all been there. You go through life, and you've got all these struggles and these dreams that break, and they have your disappointments. Your dream boat becomes a shipwreck. Your dream home becomes a money pit. Your dream team becomes Beaver Road. The dream job becomes a nightmare. And Easy Street turns into the boulevard of broken dreams. In the outline that's in the middle of your worship folder for following along, let me tell you how this plays out. Dreams are built on expectations. And disappointment occurs when our expectations exceed our experience. It's up on the screens if you're taking notes. Dreams are built on expectations. Disappointment occurs when our expectations exceed our experience. We think things like, I'll be happy when I meet Mr. Right. I'll be happy when I earn X amount of dollars. I'm going to be happy because life is always going upward and to the right. I'm really happy because life is fair. God is good. Wonderful things always come to wonderful people. Until they don't. See, part of human nature is this. We are very attached in this life to outcomes. Think about it. We say we trust God, but behind the scenes we work our fingers to the bone. We praise God when our lives, when normal looks like we thought it would, and then we question God when normal does not look like we thought it would, and we walk away from God and we think God's the one who set fire to our dreams. Now, none of this catches God off guard. In fact, God loves us so much, He gave us some advance notice that it shouldn't catch us off guard, and yet it does. But Jesus, in talking to His disciples about what they were doing and where they were going and what was going to go through their lives after He had had His resurrection experience, in John chapter 16, Jesus says these words, "In this world you will have trouble, but be of good cheer, for I have overcome the world." Now I want to focus for just a moment where He says, in this world you will have trouble. Sometimes Mr. or Mrs. Right are just as flawed, just as human as you are. Sometimes the church down the street that people run off to is just as screwed up as the church you attended for 20 years. Sometimes a drunk driver goes left of center. Sometimes the ladder falls. Sometimes the test comes back positive. Sometimes the other person gets the promotion. Sometimes the doctor misdiagnoses a condition. We live in a broken world where broken things take place. Now in this passage, looking at the first half for just a few moments, Jesus says, in this world you will have trouble. Now depending on the translation you have on your flat screen or the Bible that you carry with you, the word trouble is also in another translation called trials, another translation it calls tribulation. So just there in your notes, I just included them all. Troubles, trials, tribulations, however you want to qualify them, they're essentially the same thing. But the reality is that many of us, maybe even many of us in this room, are surprised when trouble happens. And yet right here, in this verse and others like it, the Bible never denies, the Bible never hides from us that troubles and trials and tribulations are part of the reality of this life. And here's my first thought to you this morning. Life is difficult. Say that with me. Life is difficult. See, Jesus is saying to all of us, don't get too attached to your master plan. Don't get too attached to the outcomes that you're constantly imagining in your mind. There will be detours. There will be distractions. There will be difficulties. And when you are attached to that master plan, disappointment occurs. And when disappointment occurs, then you become emotionally vulnerable and mentally vulnerable and spiritually vulnerable. When we go through disappointment, and we don't have the proper understanding, we don't have the proper perspective, here's what happens. We become susceptible to one of Satan's greatest weapons. One of Satan's greatest weapons is isolation. Because if Satan can isolate us, Satan can influence us. In her book entitled, It's Not Supposed to Be That Way, author Lisa Turquoise talks about going through these tough times and thinking that sometimes we can actually do stuff better than God. You know what I'm talking about? And she paints a picture. She says, imagine you're going through a tough time and Satan isolates you and Satan begins to influence you. And it's as if Satan is standing there before you. And he holds out one hand. And in this one hand is written the word control. And on the other hand is written the word disappointment. And he holds out control and he says to you, take control of your own life. Stop following God's rules. When you're in control, you'll be able to get everything you've ever felt denied by God. And then he holds out the other hand that has disappointment written on it. And he starts pointing out all the many disappointments in your life. And he questions and he says, well, why would God keep good things from you? I mean, he's such a restrictive God, not a loving God. His rules shouldn't really apply to your situation. Surely you know better than God does. Does that conversation sound familiar to anyone? See, folks, here's my reality and it's your reality. Disappointment happens every time you and I come face to face with our absolute inability to control other people, circumstances, and the timing in life. See, if I could control all of those things, here's what I'd do. I'd arrange my own version of perfection, and then I'd be the boss of my life and those who are in my life. But that's not my reality. I read about an extreme example of this past week when I was doing a little preparation for this conversation this morning. Back in World War II, when the Nazis developed those horrible concentration camps, one of the things that they would do is they would take the prisoners out of the barracks or out of the dorms every day. And they would ask them to go over and move this huge mound of dirt, shovel by shovel, to another part of the camp. They'd get them up the next morning, and they'd have them go out and move that same mound of dirt, shovel by shovel, back to where it came from. They'd get them up the third morning, and they'd have all these prisoners work to move this huge mound of dirt to another location, only to get them up the next day and have them move it back to where it came from. And over the course of time, what happened was these prisoners began to develop a sense of internal hopelessness. They began to give up because life had no meaning, life had no purpose, therefore they had no hope. And the prisoners who were doing this menial task that developed this internal sense of hopelessness and helplessness actually actually began to die at a much faster rate than any of the other prisoners in the camp, including those who went days and sometimes weeks without food. Because the disappointment factor, the broken dream, the trouble, the trial, the tribulation was more than they could handle, and hope dissipated when the dream was broken. Now, because life is difficult, sometimes we begin to think that God's not fair, which is my second thought to you this morning. And this is one that many Christians struggle with. We think of fairness. We think that good gets rewarded and evil or bad gets punished. And as Christians, we think, well, we're good people. We're saved. We don't continue in intentional sin. We love God and country and apple pie and mom, and we go to church and we tithe and we pray and we know our Bible and we help the widows and we help the orphans and we serve the homeless. Why in the world should I have troubles and trials and tribulations in this life? If you've ever had that internal conversation with yourself, you're not the only person to ever deal with it. Back in the Old Testament, the psalmist was struggling with these same thoughts. Here's what the psalmist said about it. But as for me, I almost lost my footing. My feet were slipping and I was almost gone. For I envied the proud when I saw them prosper despite their wickedness. They seem to live such painless lives. Their bodies are so healthy and strong. They don't have troubles like other people. They're not plagued with problems like everyone else. They wear pride like a jeweled necklace and clothe themselves with cruelty. These fat cats have everything their hearts could ever wish for. They scoff and speak only of evil. In their pride, they seek to crush others. They boast against the very heavens, and their words strut throughout the earth. And so the people are dismayed and confused, drinking in all their words. What does God know, they ask? Does the Most High even know what's happening? Look at these wicked people, enjoying a life of ease, while the riches multiply. And then here it is. Did I keep my heart pure for nothing? Did I keep myself innocent for no reason? I get nothing but trouble all day long. Every morning brings me pain. Have you been there? You turned down the overtime because you wanted to spend that season of your life raising your children well because you knew it was a short season, only to see another person you worked with get your dream job. You kept yourself pure before your marriage, only to find out after you got married that your spouse has started cheating on you. You never smoked, you never used tobacco, but how in the world did you end up with cancer? You ate healthy, but you're battling heart disease. You raised your children to love God. You raised your children in the fear and admonition of the Lord, and now they're far from God and they come over strung out on drugs. Did I keep my heart pure for nothing? As a young pastor, I went through this. I am in no way a perfect human being, no matter what that might look like in your life. It's not me. But I never went through a rebellious phase. Bible reading, prayer, fasting, honoring God, tithing, serving others less fortunate have always been hallmarks of my life. Years ago, I read a book that I absolutely loved every page of called Blue Light Jazz. The author's Donald Miller. He is a unique character. I loved that book. I loved what God was doing with his life until I finished the book. And the church I was pastoring was going through that season for about 6 weeks where you're trying to figure out finances and staffing and some of the awkwardness that happens in ministry. And one night, the enemy got my ear. He said, "Can you believe this? You've given your whole life to following this Jesus. You've tried to do right, you've tried to serve well, and you've tried to honor God with your money, and look at you. And this church is going through its own tough time. some guy like Donald Miller broke all the rules, as irreverent as they come, and God's using his life like crazy. He's got a best-selling book, and he's on the speaking circuit, and you're laying here in Atlanta, Georgia, doing jack. You know what I'm talking about? And I had to come face to face with a certain level of reality in my life. I had to come face to face with this in my own life. I get nothing but trouble all day long when some yahoo goes off and does whatever they want. It's like God's blessing them and I'm here struggling. It's not fair, God. You're not fair, God. Why did I even bother, God? Now here's what happens in moments like that. To some degree, we recognize that God is great and God is good. You remember praying that little prayer before you ate the bologna sandwich as a kid? And so you can't really blame God, so then here's what you do. You start blaming yourself, and then you become disappointed with yourself, which is the third thought there. Now disappointment, unchecked and run amok, becomes debilitating. Disappointment is like people who never earned the millions they dreamed of earning when they were teenagers play the lottery. And it seems like the more they play the lottery and the more money they lose in the lottery, the more determined they are to keep trying to win the lottery. And if the lottery is a little too far-fetched, the same thing goes on with the stock market. We invest our money in stock A, B, or C, and we do this, and we plan, and we talk to our financial planner and our broker, and then the stock market crashes, and our retirement's gone, and we feel like we're going to have to start life all over again at 62 or 65, and we're struggling with all those feelings. And we live for the next business deal. We're going to try and make this deal. We're going to try and turn a profit. We're going to flip that house. We're going to buy that space. We're going to make that sale. And what about the kid who works hard, honors his coach, is good in the locker room, but he's just not as talented no matter how hard he tries, no matter how hard she practices, she never gets to play. Except mop-up duty, as they call it. We personalize and we internalize, and rightly or wrongly we begin to blame ourselves. And then here's what happens. We begin developing a debilitating behavior, and the hope in our life becomes hopelessness. I read an article about a study done with this issue of hope and hopelessness and helplessness. It was a study done 30 years ago by Martin Seligman. And he did a study with dogs to try and get some understanding of how humans might behave. Here's what he did. He took two sets of dogs, and he put one set of dogs in a cage that had a mild electric shock. It wasn't going to electrocute them, but just a little discomfort to see how they would react. In fact, both sets of dogs went in cages where they had a mild electric shock to see how they were going to react. And naturally, both sets of dogs began jumping around, and they were uncertain, and they were a little bit scared. But in one cage, there was this like button thing. And if the dog pressed that button, the electric shock would stop. In the other cage, there was no button. The dogs in the cage that had the button somehow eventually figured out by pushing that button, the shock stopped, so they didn't have to deal with any pain or any discomfort. But over here, there was no button, and those dogs eventually just laid down and gave in to the pain. Then he switched the cages up, and he put them in different cages. There was no button in either one of these. There was still the mild electric shock, but both of them had the exact same cages. You were in this cage, and then there was a small barrier with just a little step, and if they jumped over that barrier into the other part of that cage, there was no electric shock. Here's what he found out. The dogs who had the button and were able to figure out that the button would stop the shock, and so they learned to hit the button and escape the pain, would jump around initially looking for the button. When they didn't see a button, they were jumping around. Then they would begin to jump over the barrier into the other part of the cage, and the shock went away. But the dogs who were in the cage that had no button and had just given in and laid there, never tried to climb over the barrier. As soon as they were put in the cage, they just laid down and gave up on trying to find hope or help. And it's what's called learned helplessness. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. Those poor dogs. Why did they use dogs? Because cats aren't smart enough. Jesus said, in this world you will have trouble, you will have trials, you will have tribulation. But then he interrupted it with the word but. He said, but be of good cheer. Because now that you've had a few trials and troubles and tribulations, you've figured it all out. Now that you've had a few trials and troubles and tribulation, you're in total control. Now that you've had a few setbacks, you'll never again have any disappointments. Is that how he finished that statement? No, he said, in this world you will have trouble, but be of good cheer. Why talk to me? I have overcome the world. That's why that headline there in your outline says, Jesus the Overcomer. You're going to have trouble. As you get through the trouble, you can come to a place where you have good cheer. Because Jesus is the overcomer. In other words, yes, life is difficult, but Jesus is greater than all of our troubles. He's greater than all of our trials. He's greater than all of our tribulations. And here's what's interesting. The In This World You Will Have Trouble passage was written by a man named John. And it's called the Gospel of John, chapter 16, verse number 33. This same author, this same disciple, John, then wrote letters later in life back to the church. And in those letters later in the life back to the church, here's what John said in the first letter he wrote them. Greater is he who is in you than he who is. And so my first thought with you as it relates to that, Jesus the Overcomer, is this. God is with you. God is with you. Even, you can put parenthetically, even when it feels like he's not. The Old Testament, the book of Genesis, tells the story of a man named Jacob. And Jacob had 2 wives. And the wife of the younger of the 2 wives, who was the sister of the older, was his favorite. And he had multiple sons by his first wife, but when he had the one son by the wife that he really loved, that son became his favorite son. And he named that little baby Joseph. And Joseph had a special gift from God. He could interpret dreams. And Joseph, as he was growing, it was very obvious that he was his father's favorite child. His dad even went out to meet Marcus and got him a special coat that nobody else got. I mean, this kid was loved. But this kid was also talented and good-looking, and he was a little bit cocky, a little bit arrogant. And as you can imagine, his other 8 brothers hated him. And while God had a plan for his life, and God was going to use his life, his brothers were angry and wanted to kill him, but they decided not to kill him. They decided to use him to make some money, and they sold him off into slavery. And over the next couple of decades of Joseph's life, he was as a slave in the governor's house in all of Egypt. He spent some time in jail for things he didn't do. He was falsely accused of rape. He almost went on death row. Instead of going on death row, they put him back in a special jail. And they left him there, and they helped people there. And they said they remembered when they got out. When they got out, they forgot about him. And his dream was shattered. And in Genesis chapter 39, here's what the author says about this period in Joseph's life. There are a few verses there in your outline. They're also on the screen. Genesis 39, verse 2. The Lord was with Joseph. So Joseph succeeded in everything he did as he served in the home of his Egyptian master. And Potiphar, who was that Egyptian master, noticed this and realized that the Lord was with Joseph, giving him success in everything he did. From the day Joseph was put in charge of the master's household and property, the Lord began to bless that master's household for Joseph's sake. But the Lord was with Joseph in the prison and showed him his faithful love. And the Lord made Joseph a favorite with the prison warden. See, folks, sometimes when life's not going our way, and we think that God is not listening to us, God has given up on us, the fact of the matter is, God is with us. In fact, here's what I would encourage you to do when you go home today or sometime this week. Keep your worship folder. It's got that in there. Or pull out your Bible, your flat screen. Reread those verses. And every time the name Joseph is used, replace it with your name. And whatever the context as it relates to Egypt or the king, replace it with your context in the name of your boss, or your spouse, or whatever is representing the struggle in your life. Now, I don't believe in this name and claim stuff. I'm not advocating that. I'm just saying maybe you begin to get some perspective that God is actually with you and doing more for you than you might even realize as you're sitting here during this conversation this morning. Here's my second thought. Jesus is the overcomer, so here's what you got to understand. If we think God's not fair, we can think that, but here's what you got to know. He's always right. He's always right. We're actually going to play that out a little bit more next week when we talk about what it means to be broken beyond repair. Remember a little bit ago I told you that for 5.5 years I actually got to live my teenage dream. I got to spend some time in Christian music. And what you got to understand is I didn't see that as something I was going to do for 5.5 years and then walk away from. I actually thought that's what I was going to give my entire life to. And I worked hard at it. I spent time in the recording studio with our own projects and working on other people's projects. I did the marketing. We were traveling and doing 250 dates a year. After I graduated from college, it took me 6 years to go through college because I was going 4 or 5 days a week singing across the country. I was attending a camp meeting there back in my hometown. One of my favorite preachers of the day was speaking. And I was sitting on the back row because I wanted to hear him speak, but if he went too long, I had to leave for a meeting I actually had to get to. And he did a very simple message to a camp meeting crowd that Tuesday morning about God's will for your life. I was looking at my watch and listening to him, and he gave a really simple invitation at the end. It wasn't for salvation. It wasn't for any of that stuff. It was just about what God was going to do with your life. I was just about to step out the end of the row I was sitting on and head out the back door to go get in my car when the invitation started, and the Holy Spirit put his hands on my shoulder. And before I knew it, I was walking down the aisle to go kneel and pray. One of the 3 most difficult prayers I've ever prayed in my life. God asked me in that moment to surrender to him all of my plans, all of my dreams to continue in music and to begin preaching. And I didn't want to do that. Now, I'm not one who argues with God a lot. I argued with him for 5 minutes. And that's okay. He's a big boy with big shoulders. He can take it. Then I prayed one of those 3 most difficult prayers, and I said, okay, God, I don't know how I'm going to do that. I don't know where to start. If that's what you want, that's what I'll do. And here's what happened to me in this moment. Maybe some of you have had a similar experience in whatever context of your life. But in a moment, God shatters your dream and replaces it with his dream. I didn't know those years ago, kneeling in that tabernacle floor while some man I didn't know was beating me in the back. Oh, give it to him, son! I didn't know that preaching would literally take me around the globe to all kinds of audiences I never imagined. I didn't know that preaching would lead me into California where I would meet my wife Tammy and my life got exponentially better. I didn't know that preaching would bring me to Mesa, Arizona, and I would fall in love with a group of people I never knew existed. I didn't know preaching would open all these things to me and allow me to live in some cool places and meet some wonderful people. God did. And when my dream broke, and I'm not telling you it wasn't painful in that moment, but when God broke my dream, in the midst of the ups and downs that are just part of ministry because we live in a broken world with broken people, the trajectory, the joy in my life in proclaiming the Word of God, churches like this one, and in conferences across the country and literally around the world has done more than I ever dreamed and imagined Christian music would do back in that day. I may have thought God wasn't fair, but I promise you God is always right. 1 Thessalonians, Paul's having this kind of conversation with the church that's going through a difficult time. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 8, Paul says these words, putting on faith and love as a breastplate, and the hope of salvation as a helmet. Now, faith, hope, and love. You may recognize from 1 Corinthians 13, because at least half of you in here had that read at your wedding, right? But faith, hope, and love are actually very common components of almost one piece of all Paul's letters to every church he wrote to. Very interesting that in here the other night when we shared the suicide prevention event with the city of Mesa and some other folks, that they pass out these little bracelets. We asked if we could pass them out this morning. And you know what's written on them? Faith, hope, and love. Now, faith and love, let's lay aside for just a moment. It says they are the breastplate. That's what protects your vital organs. Literally and spiritually, vicariously. Now, Paul doesn't say just put on the helmet of salvation. Paul says put on the hope of the salvation. Now think about that. Literally, especially back in that era, when they were fighting with swords and bows and arrows, and they had on metal helmets, or earlier on leather, those helmets protected the head. Would you agree that in battle, quite frankly, as in the NFL, a head injury is debilitating? And Paul is saying that salvation, which changes your heart, as we would call it, also changes your mind. It changes your thinking. If somehow we can get our heads and our hearts around this, it allows us to go from what some authors call stinking thinking to thinking God's way. Understanding that God is right and God knows best and God has a plan. If we can allow our minds to grasp that plan, all the rest of our bodies will follow. And it protects our minds and it transforms our thinking. And most of life, you follow your thinking. Track it with me. Most of the things you do in life, the sinful things, the ugly things, the horrible things, or the great things, the wonderful things, the noble things, all begin with a thought. It can be a thought towards temptation or it can be a thought towards goodness. Paul says you put that helmet on your head and your thinking begins to change. God is always right. Which leads me to my final thought. When I say Jesus is the overcomer, it may surprise you to see that thought number 3 is that sometimes you have disappointment with God. Earlier when we were talking about going through the troubles and trials and tribulations and debilitating things brought you to a point where you had disappointment with yourself. How is it Jesus the overcomer allows you to have disappointment with God? See folks, sometimes God seems silent. Sometimes God seems absent. Sometimes it seems like God doesn't care. Maybe you've even asked him, God, don't you care? Maybe you've even cried out to him, God, where are you? I told you last week what it was like to leave all the things that I left from a very well-known church, and all the perks and all the favor and all the blessings that came my way, to go to a smaller church that wanted some of that, and to be there less than a year, get fired by a church board who decided they didn't want that. And all the pain and all the struggles that I went through, if you were to get my prayer journal, and during those first 6 or 8 weeks, maybe even 3 months following the immediacy of that, you would see me asking God, God, where are you? God, why don't you care? God, why do I have to hurt like this? God, I was trying to do your plan. God, this isn't right. God, I'm disappointed with you. God, you failed me. You would see sometimes the anger begin to emerge, and I would just take my pen and draw marks across the pages in my prayer journal, sometimes so emphatically that it ripped the pages underneath it. My pain was real. My disappointment was real. And maybe you can relate to some example of your own life. But I'm about to tell you the difference. Is a difference that I understood cognitively then, that it took me a moment emotionally to catch up with. Folks, here's what I have learned in 56 years of life and 27 years of ministry. In this life, you will have disappointment. Whenever you have disappointment, you have 2 choices. You can have disappointment with God or disappointment without God. But you get to choose. Can I tell you that having disappointment with God is a much better path to walk? It's a much better proposition. It's a much better option. See, as long as you have disappointment with God, that means God is walking with you through the the disappointment. He's walking with you through the struggles. As we shared last week, God says, I will never leave you. I will never abandon you. You can have disappointment with God or you can have disappointment without God, but you're going to have disappointment in life, and you get to choose how you're going to walk through it. Are you going to walk through it alone, or are you going to walk through it with Him? You get to choose. Some of you get to choose that this morning. The psalmist made his choice in Psalm chapter 10, verse number 14. Here's what the psalmist said. But you, God, see the trouble of the afflicted. You consider their grief and take it in hand. There in your notes, would you circle that last little phrase that says, and take it in hand? Some of you can relate to this. The church that I grew up in, with Vacation Bible School and Summer Youth Camp, there was a song we used to sing back then called He's Got the Whole World in His Hands. Some of you familiar with that? He's got the whole world in His hands, and then you go, He's got you and me, brother, in His hands. He's got the itty-bitty baby in His hands. And they were just trying to teach our young minds about the greatness and the goodness and the vastness of God. But a song that I learned as like an 8 or 9-year-old in summer youth camp and Vacation Bible School that taught me about this great God who's so great that He can hold the whole world in His hands, and He can hold the precious little baby in His hands, and He can hold you and me, brother, in His hands. As I got older and some of the disappointments of life began to mount, and some of the dreams of my life began to break, I began to see a new understanding from that song. I began to think that this same God who can hold the whole world, those same hands that can hold the itty-bitty baby, or the same hands that can hold your cancer. They're the same hands that can hold you during a divorce. They're the same hands that can hold you in the midst of sickness. They're the same hands that can hold your defeat. They're the same hands that can hold your loss. They're the same hands that whatever disappointment or heartache or broken dream comes your life, God has you in His hands.
Amen.
Probably the greatest example of this, of God shattering a dream, holding someone in His hands so that His greatness is expressed, is the Old Testament man named Job. The Bible tells us that Job was very rich. It went on to proclaim his richness with his cattle and his livestock and his children and his family. And then Satan declared an open season on Job, and Job lost everything, including his health, and his friends and his wife were all coming to him and telling him, you know what? Control and disappointment, Job, go ahead and curse God. Go ahead and curse God and just die, because God doesn't care. You might as well control the rest of your life yourself. Job wouldn't do it. And Job persevered. However long that season of his life was, Job persevered. And then God moved back on the scenes and began to bless him. Quick question. Show of hands. Not a trick question. How many of you in this room are over the age of 50? Good night, Lord. How many of you who just raised your hands and are over the age of 50 have had some realm of disappointment or a broken dream, a pain, a heartache, a loss come to you since you turned 50? Can I see your hands? Almost 100%. Those of you who just raised your hands, if you trust me for just a moment, would you stand right where you are? I'm over 50. I've had some losses and some pains and disappointments and heartaches in my life since I turned 50. Quite frankly, as we've been on this journey for the past 4+ years together, trying to figure out what God is leading us to do, where we're going, and getting this property built out, I've had some disappointments and frustrations with that. Am I alone? But recently, all these years, I've been saying that my life verse is found in the book of Acts, where the Bible says David served God in his generation and then he died. In other words, as long as you have breath, you have life, and God's not done with you. When God's done with you, then He'll take you to be with Him, because He needs you more there than He does down here. I got a new life verse. Based on these experiences of 56 years of life and 27 years of ministry, and the pains and the ups and downs and the uncertainties and the struggles, here's my new life verse. It comes from the book of Job. And the Lord made Job prosperous in again and gave him twice as much as he had before. The Lord blessed the last part of Job's life even more than he had blessed the first. I figured you guys would shout when I go, oh, that's pretty good news. You're over 50. You're in the last part of your life. Unless you're going to live to be almost 200 years old like Job. But the Lord blessed Job, the last part of his life, even more than he had the first part. That doesn't mean that you're going to live the rest of your life on easy street. See, some of that means that you have a perspective of the disappointments and the struggles in life, that you've achieved some brokenness, and assuming you've achieved them and walked with God instead of without God through them, that there is hope that God's not done with you yet. My hope is God's not done with me yet. I firmly believe God's not done with this church yet. Amen. So with the rest of you stand, I'm just going to pray for everybody. And let me give you this caveat before I pray. I understand that in this conversation, I may have pushed some buttons that are still very real to you. The Bible spoke into some situations, or maybe you still think God's not fair. And it's really personal. I want you to know that at the close of this gathering this morning, we'll have some of our prayer partners up here. If you need someone to talk to for a minute, to express a hurt, a heartache, a brokenness that you're still dealing with, and you want them to pray for you, that maybe God will lead you to this perspective. Maybe you're still dealing with the palms of Satan and the control and disappointment, or maybe you still believe God's not fair, and so you're going through disappointment without God instead of through disappointment with God, and you need an adjustment in your perspective, and you just can't seem to get there on your own. These people want to pray with you. And for a moment, let me pray with you. God, some of my earliest memories are sitting at a table with my mom and my dad and my little sisters. And every meal, bowing our heads, and Mom saying, David, would you pray that little prayer? God is great. God is good. Let us thank Him for this food. You know what, God? You are great, and you are good. And my gratitude to you is extended beyond the bologna sandwich and the peanut butter jelly sandwiches. Somehow, God, while I don't enjoy it, and my frustration sometimes overwhelms me in my humanity, even in the midst of my brokenness, my disappointment, my shattered dreams, I know that you're right. That you're right in your thinking, you're right in your timing, you're right in your love and your holiness and your greatness and your goodness. And I know that I've got some more disappointment in front of me. I also know that you're not done with me. And probably many of these people standing here can feel the same way. So I get to choose. Do I walk through disappointment with you, or do I walk through disappointment without you? Now, Lord, for some of the people standing here, they're going through a season of disappointment and struggle right now, whatever that circumstance is. And this message resonated deeply with some part of their being today. Maybe, God, you would be so generous and so gracious as to use someone else in this congregation to physically be your hands and your feet, to walk with them through the frustration of a house that they can no longer afford, a promotion they didn't get, a divorce they don't want, a sickness that caught them off guard, an accident that should never have happened. God, one of the things that we aspire to be here at Connect Church is real. You are the giver of life, the provider of eternal life, and life in heaven will take place with you someday. We get that. But you also gave us a heads up that in this world we're going to have trouble, trials, tribulations. Sometimes we lose sight of that. Sometimes I lose sight of that. And as long as things are going the way I think they should, I call that normal. And when disruptions and troubles and trials come, I get irritated. I wish I didn't. Sometimes, God, you do the greatest good in this world. Sometimes you do the greatest good in my life by walking with me through those troubles, growing my character and teaching me how to become an overcomer. And Lord, for the folks in this room who are going through their own season of troubles and storms, I pray that you would very simply give them the hope of the helmet of salvation. That you would work with their thinking. That you would move in their hearts. And they would give you back control of their lives. God, we love you, we honor you. We give you all praise, adoration, and glory. We say these things in Jesus' name. Amen.